Chapter 10. Currencies, Capital, and Complexity. The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. John Maynard Keynes, 1935. Despite the theoretical and real-world shortcomings of both the Keynesian multiplier and the monetarist quantity approach to money, these are still the dominant paradigms used in public policy when economic growth falters. One need look only at the Obama stimulus and the Bernanke quantitative easing programs to see the hands of John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman hard at work. This persistence of the old school is also one driver of the new currency war, because of the expansion of public debt. This debt can be repaid only with help from inflation and devaluation. When growth falters, taking growth from other countries through currency devaluation is irresistible. Far better solutions are needed. Fortunately, economic science has not stood entirely still. A new paradigm has emerged in the past 20 years from several schools of thought, including behavioral economics and complexity theory, among others. This new thinking comes with a healthy dose of humility. Practitioners in many cases acknowledge the limitations of what is possible with the tools at hand. The new schools avoid the triumphalism of Keynes's claim to a general theory and Friedman's dictum that inflation is always and everywhere monetary. The most promising new school is complexity theory. Despite the name, complexity theory rests on straightforward foundations. The first is that complex systems are not designed from the top down. Complex systems design themselves through evolution or the interaction of myriad autonomous parts. The second principle is that complex systems have emergent properties, which is a technical way of saying the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The entire system will behave in ways that cannot be inferred from looking at the pieces. The third is that complex systems run on exponentially greater amounts of energy. The energy can take many forms, but the point is that when you increase the system's scale by a factor of 10, you increase the energy requirements by a factor of 1,000, and so on. The fourth principle is that complex systems are prone to catastrophic collapse. The third and fourth principles are related. When the system reaches a certain scale, the energy inputs dry up because the exponential relationship between scale and inputs exhausts the available resources. In a nutshell, complex systems arise spontaneously, behave unpredictably, exhaust resources, and collapse catastrophically. When you apply this paradigm to finance, you begin to see where the currency wars are headed. Complexity theory has a strong empirical foundation and has had widespread application in a variety of natural and man-made settings, including climate, seismology, and the Internet. Significant progress has been made in applying complexity to capital and currency markets. However, a considerable challenge arises when one considers the interaction of human behavior and market dynamics. The complexity of human nature sits like a turbocharger on top of the complexity of markets. Human nature, markets, and civilization more broadly are all complex systems, nested inside one another like so many Russian Matryoshka dolls. An introduction to behavioral economics will provide a bridge to a broader consideration of complexity theory and how underlying dynamics may determine the fate of the dollar and the endgame in the currency wars. Behavioral economics and complexity. Contemporary behavioral economics has its roots in mid-20th century social science. Pioneering sociologists such as Stanley Milgram and Robert K. Merton conducted wide-ranging experiments and analyzed data to develop new insights into human behavior. Robert K. Merton's most famous contribution was the formalization of the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. The idea is that a statement given as true, even if initially false, can become true if the statement itself changes behavior in such a way as to validate the false premise. Intriguingly, to make his point, Merton used the example of a run on the bank in the days before deposit insurance. A bank can begin the day on a sound basis with ample capital. A rumor that the bank is unsound, although false, can start a stampede of depositors trying to get their money all at once. Even the best banks do not maintain 100% cash on hand. So a true bank run can force the bank to close its doors in the face of depositor demands. The bank fails by the end of the day, thus validating the rumor, even though the rumor started out as false. The interaction of the rumor, the resulting behavior, and the ultimate bank failure is an illustration of a positive feedback loop between information and behavior. Merton and other leading sociologists of their time were not economists, yet in a sense they were, because economics is ultimately the study of human decision-making with regard to goods in conditions of scarcity. The sociologists cast a bright light on these decision-making processes. Former Bear Stearns CEO Alan Schwartz can attest to the power of Merton's self-fulfilling prophecy. On March 12, 2008, Schwartz told CNBC, "We don't see any pressure on our liquidity, let alone a liquidity crisis." 48 hours later, Bear Stearns was headed to bankruptcy after frightened Wall Street banks withdrew billions of dollars of credit lines. For Bear Stearns, this was a real-life version of Merton's thought experiment. A breakthrough in the impact of social psychology on economics came with the work of Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Paul Slovic, and others in a series of experiments conducted in the 1950s and 1960s. In the most famous set of experiments, Kahneman and Tversky showed that subjects, given the choice between two monetary outcomes, would select the one with the greater certainty of being received, even though it did not have the highest expected return. A typical version of this is to offer a subject the prospect of winning money structured as a choice between A, $4,000 with an 80% probability of winning, or B, $3,000 with a 100% probability of winning. For supporters of efficient market theory, this is a trivial problem. Winning $4,000 with a probability of 80% has an expected value of $3,200, or $4,000 times 0.80. Since $3,200 is greater than the alternative choice of $3,000, a rational wealth-maximizing actor would choose A. Yet in one version of this, 80% of the participants chose B. Clearly, the participants had a preference for the sure thing, even if its theoretical value was lower. In some ways, this is just a formal statistical version of the old saying, "A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush." Yet the results were revolutionary. A direct assault on the cornerstone of financial economics. Through a series of other elegantly designed and deceptively simple experiments, Kahneman and his colleagues showed that subjects had a clear preference for certain choices based on how they were presented, even though an alternative choice would produce exactly the same result. These experiments introduced an entirely new vocabulary to economics, including certainty, the desire to avoid losses, also called risk aversion; anchoring, the undue influence of early results in a series; isolation, undue weight on unique characteristics versus shared characteristics; framing, undue weight on how things are presented versus the actual substance; and heuristics, rules of thumb. The entire body of work was offered under the title Prospect Theory, which marked a powerful critique of the utility theory used by financial economists. Unfortunately, behavioral economics has been embraced by policymakers to manipulate rather than illuminate behavior, based on dubious premises about their superior wisdom. Bernanke's campaign to raise inflationary expectations by printing money and devaluing the dollar while holding rates low is the boldest contemporary version of such manipulation. Yet there are others. Orchestrated propaganda campaigns have involved off-the-record meetings of corporate CEOs with business reporters requesting that they apply a more favorable spin to business news. These attempted manipulations have their absurd side, as with the phrase "green shoots" repeated ad nauseum by cable TV cheerleaders in the spring of 2009 at a time when America was losing millions of jobs. Tim Geithner's self-proclaimed "recovery summer" in 2010 is another example. That summer came and went with no recovery at all for the 44 million on food stamps. These are all examples of what Kahneman called framing an issue to tilt the odds in favor of a certain result. What Bernanke Geithner and like-minded behavioralists in policy positions fail to see is something Merton might have easily grasped: the positive feedback effect that arises from framing without substance. If the economy is actually doing well, the message requires no framing, and the facts will speak for themselves, albeit with a lag. Conversely, when reality consists of collapsing currencies, failed banks, and insolvent sovereigns, talk about green shoots has at best a limited and temporary effect. The longer-term effect is a complete loss of trust by the public. Once the framing card has been played enough times without results, citizens will reflexively disbelieve everything officials say on the subject of economic growth, even to the point of remaining cautious if things actually do improve. This does not represent a failure of behavioral economics so much as its misuse by policymakers. Behavioral economics possesses powerful tools and can offer superb insights despite occasional misuse. It is at its best when used to answer questions rather than force results. Exploration of the paradox of Keynesianism is one probably fruitful area of behavioral economic research with potential to mitigate the currency wars. Keynesianism was promoted in part to overcome the paradox of thrift. Keynes pointed out that in times of economic distress, an individual may respond by reducing spending and increasing savings. However, if everyone does the same thing, distress becomes even worse because aggregate demand is destroyed, which can cause businesses to close and unemployment to rise. Keynesian-style government spending was thought to replace this shortage of private spending. Today, government spending has grown so large and sovereign debt burdens so great that citizens rightly expect that some combination of inflation, higher taxation, and default will be required to reconcile the debt burden with the means available to pay it. Government spending, far from stimulating more spending, actually makes the debt burden worse, and may increase this private propensity to save. Here is a conundrum that behavioral economists seem well suited to explore. The result may be the discovery that short-term government austerity brightens long-run economic prospects by increasing confidence and the propensity to spend. Complexity theory. Our definition of complex systems included spontaneous organization, unpredictability, the need for exponentially greater energy inputs, and the potential for catastrophic collapse. Another way to understand complexity is to contrast it with that which is merely complicated. A Swiss watch may be complicated, but it is not complex. The number and size of various gears, springs, jewels, stems, and castings make it complicated. Yet the parts do not communicate with one another. They touch, but do not interact. One gear does not enlarge itself because the other gears think it is a good idea. The springs do not spontaneously self-organize into a liquid metallic soup. The watch is complicated. However, complexity is much more than complication. Complex systems begin with individual components called autonomous agents, which make decisions and produce results in the system. These agents can be marine species in the oceanic food chain or individual investors in currency markets. The dynamics are the same. To be complex, a system first requires diversity in the types of agents. If the agents are alike, nothing very interesting will happen. If they are diverse, they will respond differently to various inputs, producing more varied results. The second element is connectedness. The idea is that agents are connected to one another through some channel. This can consist of electrical lines in the case of a power grid or Twitter feeds in the case of a social network, but somehow the agents must have a way to contact one another. The third element is interdependence, which means that the agents influence one another. If someone is not sure how cold it is outside and she looks out the window to see everyone wearing down coats, she might choose to wear one too. The decision is not automatic. She might choose to wear only a sweater, but in this case, a decision to wear a warm coat is partly dependent on others' decisions. The last element is adaptation. In complex systems, adaptation means more than change. Rather, it refers specifically to learning. Investors who repeatedly lose money on Wall Street themes such as buy and hold may learn over time that they need to consider alternative strategies. This learning can be collective, in the sense that lessons are shared quickly with others without each agent having to experience them directly. Agents that are diverse, connected, interdependent, and adaptive are the foundation of a complex system. To understand how a complex system operates, it is necessary to think about the strength of each of these four elements. Imagine each one has a dial that can be turned from settings of 0 to 10. At a setting of 1, the system is uninteresting. It may have the elements of complexity, but nothing much is going on. Diversity is low, connectedness and interdependence are weak, and there is almost no learning or adaptation taking place. At a setting of 10, the system is chaotic. Agents receive too much information from too many sources and are stymied in their decision-making by conflicting and overwhelming signals. Where complexity is most intriguing is what Scott Page of the University of Michigan calls the interesting in-between. This means the dials are set somewhere between 3 and 7, with each dial different from the others. This allows a good flow of information, interaction, and learning among diverse agents, but not so much that the system becomes chaotic. This is the heart of complexity, a system that continuously produces surprising results without breaking down. Two further characteristics of complex systems are of the utmost importance in our consideration of their application to currency markets and the dollar. These are emergent properties and phase transitions. Saying a system has an emergent property is like saying the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Tasting a delicious warm apple pie is more interesting than looking at the dough, sugar, apples, and butter that went into it. When systems are highly complex, emergent properties are far more powerful and unexpected. Climate is one of the most complex systems ever studied. It is extremely difficult to model, and reliable weather forecasts can be made only about 4 days in advance. Hurricanes are emergent properties of climate. Their ingredients, such as low air pressure, warm water, convection, and the like, are all easily observed, but the exact timing and location at which hurricanes will emerge is impossible to predict. We know them when we see them. The best example of an emergent property is probably human consciousness. The human body is composed of oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen with traces of copper and zinc thrown in for good measure. If one were to combine these ingredients in a vat, stir carefully, and even jolt the mixture with electricity, nothing would happen. The same ingredients combined through DNA coding, however, produces a human being. There's nothing in a carbon molecule that suggests thought, and nothing in an oxygen molecule that suggests speech or writing. Yet the power of complexity produces exactly those capabilities using exactly those ingredients. Thought emerges from the human mind in the same complex, dynamic way that hurricanes emerge from the climate. Phase transitions are a way to describe what happens when a complex system changes its state. When a volcano erupts, its state goes from dormant to active. When the stock market drops 20% in one day, its state goes from well-balanced to disorderly. If the price of gold were to double in 1 week, the state of the dollar would go from stable to freefall. These are all examples of phase transitions in complex systems. Not every complex system is poised for a phase transition. The system itself must be in a critical state. This means that the agents in the system are assembled in such a way that the actions of one trigger the actions of another until the whole system changes radically. A good example of a phase transition in a critical state system is an avalanche. A normal snowfield on a flat surface is fairly stable, yet the same amount of snow on a steep incline may be in a critical state. New snow may fall for a while, but eventually one snowflake will disturb a few others. Those others will disturb more adjacent flakes until a small slide begins that takes more snow with it, getting larger along the way until the entire mountainside comes loose. One could blame the snowflake, but it is more correct to blame the unstable state of the mountainside of snow. The snowfield was in a critical state, It was likely to collapse sooner or later, and if one snowflake did not start the avalanche, the next one could have. The same process occurs in a stock market crash. Buy and sell orders hit the market all the time, just like snowflakes on the mountain. Sometimes the buyers and sellers are arranged in highly unstable ways so that one sell order triggers a few others, which are then reported by the exchange, triggering even more sell orders by nervous investors. Soon the cascade gets out of control, and more sell orders placed in advance and triggered by stop-loss rules are automatically executed. The process feeds on itself. Sometimes the process dies out. After all, there are many small disturbances in the snow that do little harm. Sometimes the process grows exponentially until something outside the system intervenes. This intervention can take the form of trading halts, efforts by buying syndicates to reverse the flow, or even closing the exchange. Once the cascade stops, the complex system can return to a stable, non-critical state. Until the next time. The recent multiple catastrophes near Sendai, Japan perfectly illustrate how phase transitions occur in nature and society, and how collapse can spread from one system to another when all are in the critical state. Tectonic plates, oceans, uranium, and stock markets are all examples of separate complex systems. However, they can interact in a kind of metasystemic collapse. On March 11, 2011, shifting tectonic plates under the Pacific Ocean off the eastern coast of Japan caused an extremely violent 9.0 earthquake. The thrusting of the ocean floor then transferred energy from one system, the Earth's crust, to another system, the ocean, causing a 10-meter-high tsunami. The tsunami smashed into several nuclear reactors, again transferring energy, and causing another catastrophe. This time, a partial meltdown in uranium and plutonium fuel rods used in the reactors. Finally, the fear induced by the meltdown in the reactors contributed to a meltdown in the Tokyo stock market, which crashed over 20% in 2 days. The earthquake and tsunami were natural systems. The reactor was a hybrid of natural uranium and man-made design, while the stock exchange is totally man-made. Yet, they all operated under the same critical state dynamics embedded in complex systems. Importantly, phase transitions can produce catastrophic effects from small causes. A single snowflake can cause a village to be destroyed in an avalanche. This is one secret behind so-called black swans. Nassim Nicholas Taleb popularized the term black swan in his book of the same name. In that book, Taleb rightly demolished the normal distribution, the bell curve, as a way of understanding risk. The problem is that he demolished one paradigm but did not produce another to replace it. Taleb expressed some disdain for mathematical modeling in general, preferring to take on the mantle of a philosopher. He dubbed all improbably catastrophic events black swans, as if to say, stuff happens, and he left it at that. The term is widely used by analysts and policymakers who understand the stuff happens part, but don't understand the critical state dynamics of complexity behind it. Yet, it is possible to do better than throw up one's hands. A forest fire caused by lightning is a highly instructive example. Whether the fire destroys a single tree or 1,000,000 acres, it is caused by a single bolt of lightning. Simple intuition might hold that large bolts cause large fires and small bolts cause small fires, but that is not true. The same bolt of lightning can cause no fire or a catastrophic fire, depending on the critical state. This is one reason why black swans take us by surprise. They are called extreme events, but it would be more accurate to call them extreme results from everyday events. Extreme results will happen with some frequency. It is the everyday events that trigger them that we don't see coming, precisely because they are so mundane. Studying this system shows us how the everyday event morphs into the black swan. As in the case of the avalanche, what really matters is not the snowflake, but the snow. 2 more concepts are needed to round out our understanding of complexity theory. The first involves the frequency of extreme events relative to mild events in a complex system, referred to as a degree distribution. The second is the concept of scale. The bell curve degree distribution, used in financial economics, says that mild events happen all the time, and highly extreme events practically never. Yet the bell curve is only one kind of degree distribution. There are many others. The degree distribution that describes many events in complex systems is called a power law. A curve that corresponds to a power law starts high at 0, like the bell curve, but plunges quite sharply as it travels to the right, where, unlike the bell curve, it levels off at 3 well above the horizontal axis, where it tails off. In this degree distribution, the height of the curved line indicates the frequency of events, and the severity of events appears on the horizontal axis, counting 0 to 3 from left to right. As in a bell curve, extreme events occur less frequently than mild events. This is why the curve slopes downward, indicating less frequent events, as it moves off to the right toward extreme events. However, there are some crucial differences between the power law and the bell curve. For one thing, the bell curve is fatter in the region close to 0. This means that mild events happen more frequently in bell curve distributions and less frequently in power law distributions. Crucially, this power law curve never comes as close to the horizontal axis as the bell curve. The tail of the curve continues for a long distance to the right and remains separated from the horizontal axis. This is the famous fat tail, which in contrast with the tail on the bell curve does not appear to touch the horizontal axis. This means that extreme events happen more frequently in power law distributions. Television and blogs are filled with discussions of fat tails, although the usage often seems more like cliché than technical understanding. What is even less understood is the role of scale. In our example, the power curve ends at 3 for convenience. Yet in theory it could continue forever to the right without ever hitting the horizontal axis. This continuation would take the extent of possible catastrophes into unimaginable realms, like a 10.0 earthquake, something never recorded. Is there a limit to the length of the tail? Yes, at some point the fat tail drops vertically to the horizontal axis. This truncation marks the limit of the system. The size of the greatest catastrophe in a system is limited by the scale of the system itself. An example would be an active volcano on a remote island. The volcano and the island make up a complex dynamic system in a critical state. Eruptions may take place over centuries, doing various degrees of damage. Finally, the volcano completely explodes and the island sinks, leaving nothing behind. The event would be extreme, but limited by the scale of the system, one island. The catastrophe cannot be bigger than the system in which it occurs. That's the good news. The bad news is that man-made systems increase in scale all the time. Power grids get larger and more connected. Road systems are expanded. The internet adds nodes and switches. The worst news is that the relationship between catastrophic risk and scale is exponential. This means that if the size of a system is doubled, the risk does not merely double. It increases by a factor of 10. If the system size is doubled again, risk increases by a factor of 100. Double it again, and risk increases by a factor of 1,000, and so forth. Financial markets are complex systems non-parallel. Millions of traders, investors, and speculators are the autonomous agents. These agents are diverse in their resources, preferences, and risk appetites. They are bulls and bears, longs and shorts. Some will risk billions of dollars, others only a few hundred. These agents are densely connected. They trade and invest within networks of exchanges, brokers, automated execution systems, and information flows. Interdependence is also characteristic of markets. When the subprime mortgage crisis struck in early August 2007, stocks in Tokyo fell sharply. Some Japanese analysts were initially baffled about why a U.S. mortgage crisis should impact Japanese stocks. The reason was that Japanese stocks were liquid and could be sold to raise cash for margin calls on the U.S. mortgage positions. This kind of financial contagion is interdependence with a vengeance. Finally, Traders and investors are nothing if not adaptive. They observe trading flows and group reactions, learn on a continuous basis through information services, television, market prices, chat rooms, social media, and face-to-face, and respond accordingly. Capital and currency markets exhibit other indicia of complex systems. Emergent properties are seen in the recurring price patterns that technicians are so fond of. The peaks and valleys, double tops, head and shoulders, and other technical chart patterns are examples of emergence from the complexity of the overall system. Phase transitions, rapid, extreme changes, are present in the form of market bubbles and crashes. Much of the work on capital markets as complex systems is still theoretical. However, there is strong empirical evidence, first reported by Benoit Mandelbrot, that the magnitude and frequency of certain market prices plot out as a power law degree distribution. Mandelbrot showed that a time series chart of these price moves exhibited what he called a fractal dimension. A fractal dimension is a dimension greater than 1 and less than 2, expressed as a fraction, such as 1.5. The word fractal is just short for fractional. A line has one dimension, length, and a square has two dimensions, length and width. A fractal dimension of 1.5 is something in between. A familiar example is the ubiquitous stock market chart, of the kind shown in daily papers and financial websites. The chart itself consists of more than a single line. It is in fact hundreds of small lines that are all connected, but is less than an entire square. There is lots of unfilled space away from the lines, so it has a fractal dimension between 1 and 2. The irregular pattern of ups and downs is an emergent property, and a sharp crash is a phase transition. A similar fractal pattern appears whether the chart is magnified to cover hours, days, months, or years, and similar results come from looking at other charts in currency, bond, and derivatives markets. Such charts show price movements, and therefore risk, distributed according to a power law, and chart patterns with a fractal dimension significantly greater than 1.0. These features are at odds with a normal distribution of risk and are consistent with the power law degree distribution of events in complex systems. While more work needs to be done in this area, so far the case for understanding capital markets as complex systems with power law degree distributions is compelling. This brings the analysis back to the question of scale. What is the scale of currency and capital markets, and how does it affect risk? If catastrophic collapses are an exponential function of scale, then every increase in scale causes a much greater increase in risk. Capital markets continually increase in scale, which is why the black swans keep coming in greater numbers and intensity. Thinking about scale in capital markets today is like trying to measure the size of a field before the invention of the foot, the yard, or the meter. There is no commonly agreed scaling metric for computing market risk using complexity and critical state dynamics. This lack is not unprecedented. Earthquakes have been known throughout history, yet the Richter scale used to measure the intensity and frequency of earthquakes was invented only in 1935. Earthquakes are phase transitions in complex tectonic plate systems, and their frequency and intensity, measured by the Richter scale, also correspond to a power law. The similarity of stock market charts to seismographic readings is not coincidental. It will take some time for empirical work to catch up to theoretical work in this field. However, Nobel Prizes in economics likely await those who discover the best scaling metrics and accurately compute the slope of the power curve. But there is no need to wait for that work before drawing sound conclusions from the theory. Putting buildings on a known fault line was a bad idea even before the Richter scale was invented. Ignoring complexity and power laws in capital markets is a bad idea today, even in the absence of empirical perfection. The edifice of capitalism may collapse in the meantime. Even now, one can make valuable inferences about the statistical properties of risk in capital and currency markets. There is no question that the scale of these markets, however best measured, has increased dramatically in the past 10 years. A series of exchange mergers have created global mega-exchanges. Deregulation has allowed commercial banks and investment banks to combine activities. Off-balance sheet activities and separate conduit vehicles have created a second shadow banking system, as large as the visible system. Between June 2000 and June 2007, just prior to the start of the market collapse, the amount of over-the-counter foreign exchange derivatives went from $15.7 trillion to $57.6 trillion, a 367% increase. Between those same dates, the amount of over-the-counter interest rate derivatives went from $64.7 trillion to $381.4 trillion, a 589% increase. The amount of over-the-counter equity derivatives went from $1.9 trillion to $9.5 trillion in that same 7-year period, an increase of 503%. Under Wall Street's usual risk evaluation methods, these increases are not troubling. Because they consist of long and short positions, the amounts are netted against each other under the VAR method. For Wall Street, risk is always in the net position. If there is a $1 billion long position in a security and a $1 billion short position in a highly similar security, methods such as VAR will subtract the short from the long and conclude the risk is quite low, sometimes close to zero. Under complexity analysis, the view is completely different. In complex systems analysis, shorts are not subtracted from longs, they are added together. Every dollar of notional value represents some linkage between agents in the system. Every dollar of notional value creates some interdependence. If a counterparty fails, what started out as a net position for a particular bank instantaneously becomes a gross position, because the hedge has disappeared. Fundamentally, the risk is in the gross position, not the net. When gross positions increase by 500%, the theoretical risk increases by 5,000% or more because of the exponential relationship between scale and the catastrophic event size. This is why the financial system crashed so spectacularly in 2008. Subprime mortgages were like the snowflakes that start an avalanche. Actual subprime mortgage losses are still less than $300 billion, a small amount compared to the total losses in the panic. However, when the avalanche began, everything else was swept up in it, and the entire banking system was put at risk. When derivatives and other instruments are included, the total losses reached over $6 trillion, an order of magnitude greater than the actual losses on real mortgages. Failure to consider critical state dynamics and scaling metrics explains why regulators did not see it coming, and why bankers were constantly surprised at the magnitude of the problem. Regulators and bankers were using the wrong tools and the wrong metrics. Unfortunately, they still are. When a natural system reaches the point of criticality and collapses through a phase transition, it goes through a simplification process that results in greatly reduced systemic scale, which also reduces the risk of another mega event. This is not true in all man-made complex systems. Government intervention in the form of bailouts and money printing can temporarily arrest the cascade of failures, yet it cannot make the risk go away. The risk is latent in the system, waiting for the next destabilizing event. One solution to the problem of risk that comes from allowing a system to grow to a megascale is to make the system smaller, which is called descaling. This is why a mountain ski patrol throws dynamite on unstable slopes before skiing starts for the day. It is reducing avalanche danger by descaling, or simplifying, the snow mass. In global finance today, the opposite is happening. The financial ski patrol of central bankers is shoveling more snow onto the mountain. The financial system is now larger and more concentrated than immediately prior to the beginning of the market collapse in 2007. In addition to global financial descaling, another solution to complexity risk is to maintain the system size but make it more robust by not letting any one component grow too large. The equivalent in banking would be to have more banks but smaller ones with the same total system assets. It was not that many years ago that the current J.P. Morgan Chase existed as 4 separate banks: J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan, Manufacturers Hanover, and Chemical. A breakup today would make the financial system more robust. Instead, U.S. banks are bigger and their derivatives books are larger today than in 2008. This makes a new collapse, larger than the one in 2008, not just a possibility, but a certainty. Next time, however, it really will be different. Based on theoretical scaling metrics, the next collapse will not be stopped by governments, because it will be larger than governments. The 5-meter seawall will face the 10-meter tsunami, and the wall will fall. Complexity, energy, and money. Using behavioral and complexity theory tools in tandem provides great insight into how the currency wars will evolve if money printing and debt expansion are not arrested soon. The course of the currency war will consist of a series of victories for the dollar, followed by a decisive dollar defeat. The victories, at least as the Fed defines them, will arise as monetary ease creates inflation that forces other countries to revalue their currencies. The result will be a greatly depreciated dollar, exactly what the Fed wants. The dollar's defeat will occur through a global political consensus to replace the dollar as the reserve currency and a private consensus to abandon it altogether. When the dollar collapse comes, it will happen 2 ways: gradually and then suddenly. That formula, famously used by Hemingway to describe how one goes bankrupt, is an apt description of critical state dynamics in complex systems. The gradual part is a snowflake disturbing a small patch of snow, while the sudden part is the avalanche. The snowflake is random, yet the avalanche is inevitable. Both ideas are easy to grasp. What is difficult to grasp is the critical state of the system in which the random event occurs. In the case of currency wars, the system is the international monetary system based principally on the dollar. Every other market, stocks, bonds, and derivatives, is based on this system because it provides the dollar values of the assets themselves. So, when the dollar finally collapses, all financial activity will collapse with it. Faith in the dollar among foreign investors may remain strong as long as U.S. citizens themselves maintain that faith. However, a loss of confidence in the dollar among U.S. citizens spells a loss of confidence globally. A simple model will illustrate how a small loss of faith in the dollar, for any reason, can lead to a complete collapse in confidence. Start with the population of the United States as the system. For convenience, the population is set at 311,001,000 people, very close to the actual value. The population is divided based on individual critical thresholds, called a t-value in this model. The critical threshold of t of an individual in the system represents the number of other people who must lose confidence in the dollar before that individual also loses confidence. The value t is a measure of whether individuals react at the first potential sign of change or wait until a process is far advanced before responding. It is an individual tipping point. However, different actors will have different tipping points. It is like asking how many people must run from a crowded theater before the next person decides to run. Some people will run out at the first sign of trouble. Others will sit nervously but not move until most of the audience has already begun to run out. Someone else will be the last one out of the theater. There can be as many critical thresholds as there are actors in the system. The t-values are grouped into 5 broad bands to show the potential influence of one group on the other. In the first case, the bands are divided from the lowest critical thresholds to the highest as follows. For the first 1,000 people, t equals 500. For the next 1,000,000 people, t equals 10,000. For the next 10 million people, t equals 100,000. For the next 100 million people, t equals 10 million. For the next 200 million, t equals 50 million. The test case begins by asking what would happen if 100 people suddenly repudiated the dollar. Repudiation means an individual rejects the dollar's traditional functions as a medium of exchange, store of value, and reliable way to set prices and perform other counting functions. These 100 people would not willingly hold dollars and would consistently convert any dollars they obtained into hard assets such as precious metals, land, buildings, and art. They would not rely on their ability to recover these hard assets into dollars in the future, and would look only to the intrinsic value of the assets. They would avoid paper assets denominated in dollars, such as stocks, bonds, and bank accounts. The result in this test case of repudiation by 100 people is that nothing would happen. This is because the lowest critical threshold shared by any group of individuals in the system is represented by t equals 500. This means that it takes repudiation by 500 people or more to cause this first group to also repudiate the dollar. Since only 100 people have repudiated the dollar in our hypothetical case, the critical threshold of t equals 500 for the most sensitive group has not been reached, and the group as a whole is unaffected by the behavior of the 100. Since all of the remaining t values are higher than t equals 500, the behavior of those groups is also unaffected. None of the critical thresholds has been triggered. This is an example of a random event dying out in the system. Something happened initially, yet nothing else happened as a result. If the largest group that would initially repudiate the dollar is fixed at 100, this system is said to be subcritical, meaning it is not vulnerable to a chain reaction of dollar repudiation. Consider a second hypothetical case. The groupings of individuals by size of group are identical to the first case. This system of critical thresholds is identical to the system in the first case, but with two small differences. The critical threshold for the first group has been changed from t equals 500 people to t equals 100 people. The critical threshold for the second group has been changed from t equals 10,000 people to t equals 1,000 people, while the other values for t for the remaining three groups are unchanged. Put differently, we have changed the preferences of 0.3% of the population and left the preferences of 99.7% of the population unchanged. So, the new table of thresholds with the two small changes would be, for the first 1,000 people, t equals 100. For the next 1 million people, t equals 1,000. For the next 10 million people, t equals 100,000. For the next 100 million people, t equals 10 million. For the next 200 million people, t equals 50 million. Now, what happens when the same 100 citizens repudiate the dollar as in the first case? In this second case, 100 rejections will trigger the critical threshold for 1,000 people who now also reject the dollar. Metaphorically, more people are running from the movie theater. This new rejection by 1,000 people now triggers the critical threshold for the next 1 million people, and they too repudiate the dollar. Now that 1 million have repudiated the dollar, the next threshold of 100,000 is easily surpassed, and the additional 10 million people repudiate the dollar. At this point, the collapse is unstoppable. With 10 million people repudiating the dollar, another 100 million join in, and soon thereafter the remaining 200 million repudiate at once. The rejection of the dollar by the entire U.S. population is complete. The dollar has collapsed both internally and internationally as a monetary unit. This second system is said to be supercritical and has collapsed catastrophically. A number of important caveats apply. These thresholds are hypothetical. The actual values of t are unknown and possibly unknowable. The t values were broken into 5 bands for convenience. In the real world, there would be millions of separate critical thresholds, so the reality is immensely more complex than shown here. The process of collapse might not be immediate from threshold to threshold, but might play out over time as information spreads slowly and reaction times vary. None of these caveats, however, detracts from the main point, which is that minutely small changes in initial conditions can lead to catastrophically different results. In the first case, there was no reaction to the initial repudiation by 100 people, while in the second example, the entire system collapsed. Yet the catalyst was the same, as were the preferences of 99.7% of the people. Small changes in the preferences of just 0.3% of the population were enough to change the outcome from non-event to complete collapse. The system went from subcritical to supercritical based on almost zero systemic change. This is a sobering thought for central bankers and proponents of deficits. Policymakers often work from models that assume policies can continue in a step-like manner without unpredictable nonlinear breakdowns. Money printing and inflation are considered to be the answer to the lack of aggregate demand. Deficits are considered to be an acceptable policy tool to increase aggregate demand by stimulating spending in the public sector. Printing money and deficit spending continue from year to year as if the system is always subcritical, and more of the same will have no extreme impact. The model shows that this is not necessarily true. A phase transition from stability to collapse can begin in imperceptible ways based on tiny changes in individual preferences, impossible to detect in real time. These weaknesses are not discovered until the system actually collapses, but then it is too late. With this example of how complex systems operate and how vulnerable the dollar may be to a loss of confidence, we can now look at the front lines of the currency war to see how these theoretical constructs might manifest in the real world. The history of currency wars 1 and 2 shows that currency wars are last-ditch responses to much larger macroeconomic problems. Over the past 100 years, those problems have involved excessive and unpayable debts. Today, for the third time in a century, the debt overhang is choking growth and inciting currency war, and the problem is global. Europe's sovereign borrowers and banks are in worse shape than those in America. Housing booms in Ireland, Spain, and elsewhere were as reckless as the boom in the United States. Even China, which has enjoyed relatively strong growth and large trade surpluses in recent years, has an over-leveraged shadow banking system run by provincial authorities, a massively expanding money supply, and a housing bubble that could burst at any moment. The post-2010 world may be different in many ways from the 1920s and 1970s, but the massive overhang of unpayable, unsustainable debt is producing the same dynamic of deleveraging and deflation by the private sector, offset by efforts at inflation and devaluation by governments. The fact that these policies of inflation and devaluation have led to economic debacles in the past does not stop them from being tried again. What are the prospects for avoiding these adverse outcomes? How might the global debt overhang be reduced in a way that could encourage growth? Some analysts posit that the political struggle on government spending is just posturing, and that once matters become urgent and key elections are over, sober minds will sit down and do the right thing. Others rely on highly debatable projections of growth, interest rates, unemployment, and other key factors to put deficits on a glide path to sustainability. There is good reason to view these forecasts with doubt, even pessimism. The reason has to do with the dynamics of society itself. Just as currency wars and capital markets are examples of complex systems, so those systems form part of larger complex systems with which they interact. The structure and dynamics of these larger systems are the same, except the scale is greater, and the potential for collapse greater still. Complexity theorists Eric J. Chason and Joseph A. Tainter supply the tools required to understand why discipline will likely fail and why currency wars and dollar collapse may follow. Chason, an astrophysicist, is a leading theorist of complexity and evolution. Tainter, an anthropologist, is also a leading theorist of complexity as it relates to the collapse of civilization. Their theories, taken together and applied to capital markets as affected by contemporary politics, should give us pause. Chason considers all complex systems from the cosmic to the subatomic, and zeroes in on life generally and humans in particular as being the most complex systems ever discovered. In his book, Cosmic Evolution, he considers the energy requirements associated with increasing complexity, and in particular the energy density of the system, which relates energy, time, complexity, and scale. Chason posits that the universe is best understood as the constant flow of energy between radiation and matter. The flow dynamics create more energy than is needed in the conversion, providing free energy needed to support complexity. Chasen's contribution was to define complexity empirically as a ratio of free energy flow to density in a system. Stated simply, the more complex a system is, the more energy it needs to maintain its size in space. Chasen's theories are well supported, starting with the original laws of thermodynamics through the more recent sophisticated local observations of increasing order and complexity in the universe. It is well understood that the sun uses far more energy than a human brain. Yet, the sun is vastly more massive than a brain. When these differences in mass are taken into account, it turns out that the brain uses 75,000 times as much energy as the sun, measured in Chasen's standard units. Chasen has also identified one entity vastly more complex than the human brain: society itself in its civilized form. This is not surprising. After all, a society of brainy individuals should produce something more complex than the individuals themselves. This is wholly consistent with complexity theory, civilization being just an emergent property of individual agents with the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Chasen's key finding is that civilization, adjusted for density, uses 250,000 times the energy used by the sun and 1,000,000 times the energy used by the Milky Way. To see the implications of this for macroeconomics and capital markets, begin with the understanding that money is stored energy. The classic definition of money includes the expression store of value, but exactly what value is being stored? Typically, value is the output of labor and capital, both of which are energy intensive. In the simplest case, a baker makes a loaf of bread using ingredients, equipment, and her own labor, all of which use energy or are the product of other forms of energy. When the baker sells the loaf for money, the money represents the stored energy that went into making the bread. This energy can be unlocked when the baker purchases some goods or services, such as house painting, by paying the painter. The energy in the money is now released in the form of time, effort, equipment, and materials of the painter. Money works exactly like a battery. A battery takes a charge of energy, stores it for a period of time, and releases the energy when needed. Money stores energy in the same way. This translation of energy into money is needed to apply Chasen's work to the actual operation of markets and society. Chasen deals at the highest macro level by estimating the total mass, density, and energy flow of human society. At the level of individual economic interactions within society, it is necessary to have a unit to measure Chasen's free energy flows. Money is the most convenient and quantifiable unit for this purpose. The anthropologist Joseph A. Tainter picks up this thread by proposing a related yet subtler input-output flow analysis that also utilizes complexity theory. An understanding of Tainter's theory is also facilitated by the use of the money as energy model. Tainter's specialty is the collapse of civilizations. That's been a favorite theme of historians and students since Herodotus documented the rise and fall of ancient Persia in the 5th century BC. In his most ambitious work, The Collapse of Complex Societies, Tainter analyzes the collapse of 27 separate civilizations over a 4,500-year period, from the little-known Kachin civilization of Highland Burma to the widely known cases of the Roman Empire and ancient Egypt. He considers an enormous range of possible factors explaining collapse, including resource depletion, natural disaster, invasions, economic distress, social dysfunction, religion, and bureaucratic incompetence. His work is a tour de force of the history, supposed causes, and processes of civilizational collapse. Tainter stakes out some of the same ground as Chasen and complexity theorists in general by demonstrating that civilizations are complex systems. He demonstrates that as the complexity of society increases, the inputs needed to maintain society increase exponentially, exactly what Chasen would later quantify with regard to complexity in general. By inputs, Tainter refers not specifically to units of energy the way Chasen does, but to a variety of potentially stored energy values, including labor, irrigation, crops, and commodities, all of which can be converted into money, and frequently are for transactional purposes. Tainter, however, takes the analysis a step further, and shows not only do inputs increase exponentially with the scale of civilization, but the outputs of civilizations and governments decline per unit of input when measured in terms of public goods and services provided. Here is a phenomenon familiar to every first semester microeconomics student: the law of diminishing returns. In effect, society asks its members to pay progressively more in taxes, and they get progressively less in government services. The phenomenon of marginal returns produces an arc that rises nicely at first, then flattens out, and then declines. In this thesis, the familiar arc of marginal returns mirrors the arc of the rise, decline, and fall of civilizations. Tainter's main point is that the relationship between people and their society in terms of benefits and burdens changes materially over time. Debates about whether government is good or bad, or whether taxes are high or low, are best resolved by first situating society on the return curve. In the beginning of a civilization, returns to investment and complexity, usually in the form of government, are typically extremely high. A relatively small investment of time and effort in an irrigation project can yield huge returns in terms of food output per farmer. Short periods of military service shared across the entire population can yield huge gains in peace and security. A relatively lean bureaucracy to organize irrigation, defense, and other efforts of this type can be highly efficient as opposed to ad hoc supervision. At the beginning of civilization, the research budget for the invention of fire was zero, while the benefits of fire were incalculable. Compare this to the development costs of the next generation of Boeing aircraft relative to the small improvements in air travel. This dynamic has enormous implications for the presumed benefits of increase in government spending beyond some low base. Over time, and with increasing complexity, returns on investment in society begin to level off and turn negative. Once the easy irrigation projects are completed, society begins progressively larger projects covering longer conduits with progressively smaller amounts of water produced. Bureaucracies that started out as efficient organizations turn into inefficient obstacles to improvement, more concerned with their own perpetuation than with service to society. Elites who manage the institutions of society slowly become more concerned with their own share of a shrinking pie than with the welfare of society as a whole. The elite echelons of society go from leading to leeching. Elites behave like parasites on the host body of society and engage in what economists call rent-seeking, or the accumulation of wealth through non-productive means, postmodern finance being one example. By 2011, evidence had accumulated to show that the United States was well down the return curve to the point where greater exertions by more people produced less for society, while elites captured most of the growth in income and profits. 25 hedge fund managers were reported to have made over $22 billion for themselves in 2010, while 44 million Americans were on food stamps. CEO pay increased 27% in 2010 versus 2009, while over 20 million Americans were either unemployed or had dropped out of the labor force but wanted a job. Of Americans with jobs, more worked for the government than in construction, farming, fishing, forestry, manufacturing, mining, and utilities combined. One of the best measures of the rent-seeking relationship between elites and citizens in a stagnant economy is the Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality. A higher coefficient means greater income inequality. In 2006, shortly before the recent recession began, the coefficient for the United States reached an all-time high of 47, which contrasts sharply with the all-time low of 38.6 recorded in 1968, after 2 decades of stable gold-backed money. The Gini coefficient trended lower in 2007, but was near the all-time high again by 2009 and trending higher. The Gini coefficient for the United States is now approaching that of Mexico, which is a classic oligarchic society characterized by gross income inequality and concentration of wealth in elite hands. Another measure of elite rent-seeking is the ratio of amounts earned by the top 20% of Americans compared to amounts earned by those living below the poverty line. This ratio went from a low of 7.7 to 1 in 1968 to a high of 14.5 to 1 in 2010. These trends in both the Gini coefficient and the wealth-to-poverty income ratio in the United States are consistent with Tainter's findings on civilizations nearing collapse. When society offers its masses negative returns on inputs, those masses opt out of society, which is ultimately destabilizing for masses and elites. In this theory of diminishing returns, Tainter finds the explanatory variable for civilizational collapse. More traditional historians have pointed to factors such as earthquakes, droughts, or barbarian invasions. But Tainter shows that civilizations that were finally brought down by barbarians had repelled barbarians many times before, and civilizations that were destroyed by earthquakes had rebuilt from earthquakes many times before. What matters in the end is not the invasion or the earthquake, but the response. Societies that are not overtaxed or overburdened can respond vigorously to a crisis and rebuild after disaster, while those that are overtaxed and overburdened may simply give up. When the barbarians finally overran the Roman Empire, they did not encounter resistance from the farmers. Instead, they were met with open arms. The farmers had suffered for centuries from Roman policies of debased currency and heavy taxation with little return, so, to their minds, the barbarians could not possibly be worse than Rome. In fact, because the barbarians were operating at a considerably less complex level than the Roman Empire, they were able to offer farmers basic protections at a very low cost. Tainter makes one additional point that is particularly relevant to 21st century society. There is a difference between civilizational collapse and the collapse of individual societies or nations within a civilization. When Rome fell, it was a civilizational collapse because there was no independent society to take its place. Conversely, European civilization did not collapse again until after the 6th century AD, because for every state that collapsed, there was another state ready to fill the void. The decline of Spain or Venice was met by the rise of England or the Netherlands. From the perspective of complexity theory, today's highly integrated, networked, and globalized world more closely resembles the codependent states of the Roman Empire than the autonomous states of medieval and modern Europe. In Tainter's view, collapse, if and when it comes again, will this time be global. No longer can any individual nation collapse. World civilization will disintegrate as a whole. In sum, Chasen shows how highly complex systems, such as civilizations, require exponentially greater energy inputs to grow, while Tainter shows how those civilizations come to produce negative outputs in exchange for the inputs, and eventually collapse. Money serves as an input-output measure applicable to a Chasen model because it is a form of stored energy. Capital and currency markets are powerful complex systems nested within the larger Tainter model of civilization. As society becomes more complex, it requires exponentially greater amounts of money for support. At some point, productivity and taxation can no longer sustain society, and elites attempt to cheat the input process with credit, leverage, debasement, and other forms of pseudo-money that facilitate rent-seeking over production. These methods work for a brief period before the illusion of debt-fueled pseudo-growth is overtaken by the reality of lost wealth amid growing income inequality. At that point, society has three choices: simplification, conquest, or collapse. Simplification is a voluntary effort to descale society and return the input-output ratio to a more sustainable and productive level. An example of contemporary systemic simplification would be to devolve political power and economic resources from Washington, D.C. to the 50 states under a reinvigorated federal system. Conquest is the effort to take resources from neighbors by force in order to provide new inputs. Currency wars are just an attempt at conquest without violence. Collapse is a sudden, involuntary, and chaotic form of simplification. Is Washington the new Rome? Have Washington and other sovereigns gone so far down the road of higher taxes, more regulation, more bureaucracy, and self-interested behavior that social inputs produce negative returns? Are certain businesses, financial and institutional elites so linked to government that they are aligned in the receipt of outsized tribute for negative social utility? Are so-called markets now so distorted by manipulation, intervention, and bailouts that they no longer offer reliable price signals for the allocation of resources? Are the parties most responsible for distorting the price signals also those receiving the misallocated resources? When the barbarians arrive next time, in whatever form, what is the payoff for resistance by average citizens compared to allowing the collapse to proceed and letting the elites fend for themselves? History and complexity theory suggest that these questions are not ideological. Instead, they are analytic questions, whose relevance is borne out by the experience of scores of civilizations over 5 millennia and the study of 10 billion years of increasing complexity in nature. Science and history have provided a complete framework using energy, money, and complexity to understand the risks of a dollar collapse in the midst of a currency war. What is most important is that the systems of immediate concern, currencies, capital markets, and derivatives, are social inventions and therefore can be changed by society. The worst-case dynamics are daunting, but they are not inevitable. It is not too late to step back from the brink of collapse and restore some margin of safety in the global dollar-based monetary system. Unfortunately, the deck is stacked against common-sense solutions by the elites who control the system and feed at the trough of complexity. Diminishing marginal returns are bad for society, but they feel great for those on the receiving end of the inputs, at least until the inputs run dry. Today, the financial resources being extracted from society and directed toward elites take the form of taxes, bailout costs, mortgage frauds, usurious customer rates and fees, deceptive derivatives and bonuses. As citizens are crushed under the weight of this rent extraction, collapse grows more likely. Finance must be returned to its proper role as the facilitator of commerce rather than a grotesque end in itself. Complexity theory points the way to safety through simplified and smaller-sized institutions. Incredibly, Treasury Secretary Geithner and the White House are actively facilitating a large-scale and more concentrated banking industry, including a proto-global central bank housed at the IMF. Any success in this endeavor will simply hasten the dollar's denouement.